We're going to start off with talking about the myths that we kind of want to debunk about women in art. My name's Sarah Jaffray. I'm an art historian with an expertise in modern and contemporary art. I cover quite a lot of things from the Renaissance to 19th century Japan and lots of other places in between.
My name's Mancio. I'm an art historian and a writer. I'm a tour director for Ace Cultural Tours and the co-founder and co-director of a feminist art collective called Infems, along with the artists Rebecca Fontaine-Wolf and Roxana Halls.
Welcome to Artfully Said. Do you have any myths that come up often?
I have lots of myths. Lots of myths. But one that particularly annoys me is the myth of exceptionalism, because we see this a lot in contemporary writing. Oh, you know, so-and-so was so unusual and so unique. Mm-hmm. And a lot of feminist scholarship at the moment is about debunking that myth and saying, actually, there were lots of women writing. There were lots of women running workshops, you know, going way back to the Renaissance in the 18th century and so on. And as Griselda Pollock pointed out, the great queen, by the way, of art history, very often what's happened is that it's modern art historians that have written these women out. So these women were there, and they chose not to mention them in their art histories when they were creating the Western art canon. Yeah, so that's one.
No, that's a big one for me too. Like the greatest artist of their generation and all that sort of stuff. Like the only woman who ever did this ever, and it's simply not true. And that kind of backs onto my myth that I want to debunk is like the girl boss myth.
Yes,
that in order to be an artist, women always have to overcome some sort of huge trauma or obstacle, and that makes their whole life and everything about that one trauma or that one thing that they overcome. When a lot of women were really kind of mentored into the arts profession by their families, or maybe they weren't major famous artists working for kings or queens, but they were making art in their homes. And so we have to get rid of this kind of like extraordinariness that you're talking about. Like they had to always pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and that is like this story that all women are given, and that kind of muddies the waters completely about what are the actual stories of each individual.
Absolutely. And Gentileschi, I think, is a major example. Why are we always talking about Gentileschi and no one has heard of Sofonis Banguisola, Elisabetta Sirani, Lavinia Fontana. These were all successful women in their own time, but they don't have the backstory, so they don't get talked about in the same way. Yeah,
the sensationalized story about and this idea of overcoming is always exhausting. And you know, some women didn't have much to overcome.
No,
like there were lots of very, very successful women who were handed quite a lot of things in their lives. Like Angelica Kaufman was one who was very much just had a clear ride. There's like Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who came from a very, very prestigious family line and was given, you know, mentored into the arts profession and became the painter to the queen. So, you know, it's not all the same story.
No. Yeah. I think that's a brilliant point.
Yeah. Not everyone's a feminist girl boss, essentially. Yeah.
One thing that always comes up is, why do we even need the category woman artist? And again, you know, thanks to our peers, we can go way back to the 1970s when you could argue that a feminist art history comes into being. And we've got to, you know, credit those women hugely for the work that they did. The obvious one, Linda Nochlin, why are there no great women artists?
She's my god. She is my god, yes.
But why are we still talking about this so many years on? Why is it now suddenly fashionable to talk about women artists? And has anything actually changed that much? Because I feel like we've gone backwards in a lot of ways. I feel like the discourse is now at kind of a very basic level compared to what those women were saying in the 70s, 80s, even 90s. I think we've gone back to a kind of you know, let's excavate the histories of all these women and let's say that every woman artist was great.
Yeah.
And actually, I think we should be allowed to say, no, actually, some of them are quite mediocre in the way that there are mediocre male artists. It's normal. They can't all be great, right?
It's exactly that's again, that idea of exceptionalism you're talking about, and the girl boss myth and all that sort of thing, where everything becomes a soundbite and everything becomes comfortable and easy, and we have to do this in order to make women palatable. We have to always make them great heroes. And I always think about Ursula K. Le Guin's essay, The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, which is a touchstone for me. It's not about art at all, but it's about the narratives that we tell each other of our histories and our stories. And she talks about how the hero narrative is the one we always tell. But the way that life is sustained is the carrier bag, the little nuts and berries that people collect. And I think when we talk about the greatness, we're missing a lot of the stories of perhaps domestic people, domestic workers, women who could made small things in their homes, and they're not necessarily great, but we give a really skewed view of the past when we talk about how everything's exceptional. And we don't humanize. We turn them into heroes as opposed to real people. And that's I think one of the reasons what we have to think about this idea of women artists and what that means.
And of course it's in some ways, of course, it's important to still refer, I think, to women artists, because the statistics are still dire. If we're looking both commercially and in terms of solo shows, and just generally, they are still dire. But we have to look at it, I think, in bigger terms, that of course we still need to be talking about feminism, because we're going backwards in so many things. You just have to look around the world, and some absolutely horrifying things are happening everywhere to women's rights. This kind of rollback of things that we thought we had achieved and won are now being rolled back. So I think it's important to talk about women within the broader context of the structural inequalities that are preventing them from perhaps succeeding in the same way as their peers. However, and I've curated all solo female shows, incidentally, so I can't, I'm not against that idea, but I do think there's something to be said for reinserting women, for showing them alongside their male peers as equals. Rather than always creating this separate sphere, if you like.
Calling them out, separating them, putting them in a parallel space as opposed to being integrated.
That's it.
And I think what you're saying is, like, this is what Linda Nochlund's essay, the 1971, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, is not about making every women artist great, but talking about the structural oppression. And so it gets us back to institutional, like you said earlier, the canon. We need to critique the institutional structures as opposed to creating a new structure where we begin to just say, this is what, women artists are great, as opposed to, like, well, what system has excluded them? Like, what can we do to change the system, as opposed to creating a new system that then excludes other people or other stories? And that's, I think, what the issue is. And we do need to talk about women's history, because it is special and has lots of stories of that. But we also have to think about the system that has forced us to create these two divide.
And the art historians, because I'm very conscious that, you look around you often, and we've been in these meetings, and you are looking at predominantly white middle class women. If we're looking at art historians, where are the working class art historians? Where are the art historians of color? There are some, but again, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to intern in a gallery if you don't have wealthy enough parents that you can live at home in London, you can attend all the openings, you can network. So there's lots of structural problems to be addressed before we can even begin to really broaden the sphere of who's talking about art, who's writing about art, who's broadcasting about art, who's making art. These things are...
They do matter.
They matter, and they're often swept under the carpet. So it's great that we talk about the fact that, in the 19th century, women are barred from the life drawing class, etc. Okay, that's great. Let's talk about now and other ways in which women are being barred from entering certain cliques.
Yeah.
Not legally barred, but barred in
other
through
ways.
Circumstance. Yeah.
In like unseen and unspoken kind of institutional.
Yes.
Created. I'm not articulating this very well.
No, great.
But yeah, exactly. Like the idea of like the unseen class system, the unseen system of privilege, and it is really stark. I mean, I think about what you're saying about the 19th century, and I love the Impressionists, and we're talking about the Impressionists were relatively inclusive for a movement that was driven by men.
Yes.
But the two women who are at the center of that movement were incredibly wealthy.
Exactly.
And were encouraged by their families to become professional artists because they were allowed to. Whereas someone like Marie Bracquemont, who was working class, and she's one of the trois grandes dames of Impressionism, one of the three great women of Impressionism. She doesn't make as much art. She's not allowed to be as much of part of the picture because she was working class and had to get on with
earning
other things,
a living.
Yeah.
The other women didn't have to actually sell their work.
Exactly.
And that makes a huge difference. And I've talked about this in relation to men because I'm currently writing about the role of sex workers in art. And there's a lot about, Toulouse-Lautrec. He was a bohemian. He was such a friend of the sex workers. At the end of the day, though, Toulouse-Lautrec had the advantage that when he ran out of money, he can pivot to his conservative religious mother and get her to subsidize his income. This isn't something that was available to everybody.
Exactly.
So all these things
they still exist today.
Yes, they exist again. Absolutely.
Yeah.
The trustafarians, etc.
Exactly. And that's what, like, this conversation about women in art is really important because it's like, this is exactly what feminism is about. It's like pulling up the rock and looking underneath at all the little worms and ugliness underneath there, because it's not about, just... Yeah, as we've said many times already, like just making it this category and that fixes everything. It's like new. It's just the start of unpulling the thread of everything.
And I've been ranting at the National Gallery recently. Might be sick of my pose. But, they have so few works by women artists in their collection. Okay, you can argue that's historic. It's done. They now have no money to collect, whatever. So why, National Gallery, are you hanging a work by Rosa Bonheur
over the staircase?
Above a staircase where I cannot even bring a group of people to look at it because they're squashed between the staircase and the exit of the shop.
Yep.
This is just, I'm sorry, this is just, for me, insensitive curation.
I saw that. My jaw dropped. And also there was no label.
Months. Yeah. She was huge in the 19th century, a really important artist.
Yeah.
And you do this.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, there are works by more mediocre male artists hanging in prime positions in other galleries. So sometimes, we really need to be open and alert to all these incidences, I think, of miscuration, mislabeling, just lack of sensitivity. So don't then go and make a post for International Women's Day when your own collection is problematic.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just about talking about it,
Yes.
like not pretending that it's all, perfect and like this is empowering. It's like, no, let's talk about the systems and the structures of things, because that's how we get to, that's how our cultural memory is created. Is with these sorts of things. And the exclusion of that from, particularly, as you said, the Western European canon of art.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the danger, I think, that we're not rewriting the canon, which is what we need to do. We're just trying to insert women back into the canon, which, as I say, was being done in the 70s and 80s. We should have moved beyond that by now.
Yeah. We tried, but we're ranting. Here's our rant. Okay. So this idea of all women exhibitions, I'll call it the first, but I'm not going to say that declaratively. No. Perhaps the first that we know of is Peggy Guggenheim's 31 Women at her Art of the Century gallery in 1943. And it's been heavily criticized because Peggy Guggenheim can never really win.
No, she's a very divisive figure.
Yeah, she is,
isn't she? Yes.
Yeah, and so she apparently, all the women, or most of the women in the show, were all people she knew, and were all friends of hers, and so she's been criticized for doing that.
Which is, by the way, really quite common.
It is
much
so common.
more common than people are going to acknowledge.
Exactly.
It's very common.
Yeah, and then certain artists, women artists like Georgia O'Keeffe, refused to participate because she didn't want to be labeled in that way. But at the same time, it kind of shone a light on the idea that women had been excluded and that they weren't really a part of the actual movements that were going on at the time. So they needed their own space to show. And Guggenheim herself was a supporter of feminist causes often, and was a patron of several feminist writers in her lifetime. So I think we need to talk about that stuff happening in the 1940s because we think of it as, again, only happening now.
Exactly.
But there have been moments of that, however imperfect, throughout history.
Absolutely. And this is something when we started in Femmes that we were very keen to do, give a kind of exhibition space to women. And then in later shows, what we decided to do is to kind of reverse the typical statistics. So have 80% women and 20% men in our shows, which again is an interesting dynamic, really. And I think the other thing that happened, and we can think of the Turner Prize, for example, years ago, when there was an outcry because there was an all-female shortlist. After years and years of all-male shortlist, nobody said, oh, it's an all-male shortlist for years, but suddenly an all-female shortlist seemed strange or, contrived in some way. So we've got to get away from that idea as well, I think. Yeah. And there is a space, as I say. I mean, the Barbican is one of my favourites. The Barbican Gallery put on that fabulous show of Lee Krasner, and I think it was really great just to have a whole show dedicated to one artist in that way. So definitely we need more shows like that. Take note, Royal Academy, by the way. Again, really lacking apart from the usual suspects, because I think this is the other problem, that you get the same few star artists, and we can name them. Marina Abramović, Yayoi Kusama, Tracy Emin, and not to take away from those artists, but it does that same thing of creating this kind of superstardom.
It does,
and not leaving space for women artists who are emerging or mid-career artists who have less of maybe a USP than those artists, less persona-driven than those artists. I mean, most people probably can't tell you what Rachel White-Reed looks like, for example, right? But we all know what Tracy Emin looks like.
Exactly. And
or Marina Abramović. So these are kind of artists that have created personas apart from anything else.
Exactly. It's, again, this idea, it's the system, like what feeds the system. The exceptional, the well-known, the thing that is, easiest. And that is, the hard work is to be done in where you're talking about is those lesser known, or to build those people up. And that's rewriting the structures and the systems.
Yes, those people that don't want to be celebrities, essentially, that want the work to speak for themselves. That's quite a big difference.
Quick interval and we'll be right back. Did you know your favourite Artfully Said guests are closer than you think? With monthly talks by accredited lecturers across the UK and beyond, there's an Arts Society near you. Join your local Arts Society at theartsociety.org. Thank you to Boom Radio for sponsoring this episode of Artfully Said, brought to you by the Arts Society.
Before the Beatles, my life was black and white, and after the Beatles, my life was colour.
Boom Radio. We're here because you were there.
Boom Radio plays 60s classics, 70s memories and hidden gems. Find it on your DAB Plus radio across most of the UK, or ask for it on your smart speaker. OK, let's get back to it.
Do we believe that women's art looks different from men's art?
Yes and no. I mean, it depends on the era. And that's the thing, like, about women's art is it's I'm just thinking of an example of like Rachel Reusch, 17th century, 18th century flower painter. And she paints flower paintings because that was actually, the limit that was placed upon her, not because she couldn't be a history painter. Women were not really allowed to be history painters, especially in the Netherlands where she's from. But she was also a scientist. And her father was a scientist and encouraged her to be scientific. And her works are botanically accurate and they include insects and things. And that is also linked to textile work that women had to do in domestic spaces. So they had to cultivate silkworms and understand environments. So that is very women.
Yes.
You know, that it's very centric to that.
Yes.
There are male flower painters and all that, but those sorts of stories are because she's a woman.
Yes. I mean, the kind of famous example of the Judith and Holofernes.
Yes,
the two great paintings, Caravaggio, one by Caravaggio, one by Gentileschi. And I always used to put them side by side when I had new students totally new to art history. And I'd be, okay, have a guess. Which one do we think was painted by a man and which one was painted by a woman? And what amazed me, actually, was that they always got it right. Why did they get it right? Because they said, well, a woman is going to paint practically what it looks like.
That's
to
great.
kill a man. They're going to roll up their sleeves. Yeah, it's going to take two of them because of the physical strength. So hers is actually the much more violent painting.
Yes.
His is much more delicate. You know, she's got the sword at arm's length. She's got this white blouse on that was originally transparent.
Yeah.
She's incredibly dainty. And there's no way she could actually cut his head off from that angle.
No.
It's we have to.
She's like sawing some cheese, like in a very.
and I am a huge Caravaggio fan, so a great lover of his. But it fascinated me that that's how people perceived it. That they got it right. They didn't say, "Oh, well, the more violent painting was painted by a man." So they were looking at it from a really interesting perspective. So I'm not convinced that you can always tell.
No,
but. On the other hand, you know, sometimes the clues might be there in the composition.
Well, yeah, because especially historically, women had to serve different roles and had to play certain roles in society. Depending on time and place.
Yes.
Because it's not the same for every single culture across the globe.
Totally.
And so, yeah, it's interesting to see, like, in that comparison, why would the woman's artwork look differently to the man's artwork? That's the question you ask instead of course, this is different because it must be because she's this way and he's this way and that's what a man does and that's what a woman does. It's, no, what questions does it raise? And that's a more interesting question, I think, to ask about how does this talk about, how might this get us into talking about gender roles or the way that people had to represent themselves or the things that they did in their lives.
I'm always reminded of Barbara Hepworth saying that, for instance, she couldn't make small sculptures. I mean, she obviously did, but she felt that she couldn't because the minute she made something small, people would say, it's because you're a woman.
Yeah.
Whereas if Henry Moore made something small, he's being sensitive. And then, you know, and therefore she makes these extra big things to prove that she can.
Yeah.
And Georgia O'Keeffe is another great example where at one point she literally says, I hate bloody flowers, because that's all anyone thinks that she can paint.
Exactly.
They misrepresent her and insist that there's kind of some sexual undertone to these. Actually, she's talking about female sexuality, despite her saying, no, I am not. You know?
No one believes. You know.
She has to go and paint skulls in order for people to accept that she's also trying to paint the great American painting. You know, so as you say, that the circumstances differ. Yeah,
it's like this idea of, you know, that a woman's experience in life is always linked to domesticity, or that there's always a sentimentality about her work, or that sort of use, you know,
mother child,
yeah, and that you know, again, time and space specific, because some women, that is their realm, and it is their role to do, but within that realm, it's not necessarily like being shunted to the side and not having any kind of duties. No. There's so much that happens in the home space. And I have this cushion cover at the V&A that I absolutely love. It's an image of hunting and fishing, and it was just for someone's home. It was not for a king's home. It was for whoever's home. We don't know exactly when it was made or by whom it was made. It's from around 1600. And it shows such level of knowledge of nature and a level of knowledge of plants. It's got a thistle. It's got all these like things within it. And so the domestic life is actually knowing plants.
Yes, exactly.
And how they function, and knowing how the times of the year, and then also knowing really high level embroidery and all the things that are to do with the household are actually not second class or less important.
So, and they can be subversive. I mean, I'm thinking of the performance artist Bobby Baker, for example, who's kind of made a comeback quite recently, and originally I interviewed for my PhD many, many years ago. And I remember her saying that at art school, the prevailing thing was abstract painting. And she couldn't get to grips with this. And yet what was she doing? She brings that into the domestic sphere, and suddenly she's working with ingredients, throwing these ingredients around in the kitchen in a way that is similar to a Pollock making an abstract painting, but it's more radical because she's doing it in the kitchen space where the woman is meant to be domestic and neat, and she's allowing that kind of mess and that abject nature of the ingredients to really come to the fore. So there, domestic doesn't have to be safe, conservative, tame.
I mean, that's why the Judy Chicago and in the Woman House, the famous Woman House, where she had all of her students make a different room in a house devoted to different parts of the body, and it is as far away from tame as you can get. It's about how, and also Louise Bourgeois was doing that in the 40s.
Of course she was.
She, femme maison,
exactly,
woman house, and like the fact that we're linked to the house, but that's not exactly what you think it is.
No.
And that's that can be a place of subversiveness. It can be a place of blood and guts. In the case of bodies.
Yes.
And more than just the perfect little sentimental things. And I think we see this, you find it in a lot of art across history. That's the other thing. I think we often make the modern and contemporary a place of exclusive subversion when it's not. Not everyone fits into their nice little boxes throughout history.
And for a long time, I think there were art forms that were considered second-class art forms. Ceramics, for instance, were not considered fine art. There's always this thing, is it pottery, is it fine art? Until very often a male artist comes along, and no dissing Grayson Perry, but, suddenly it's considered fine art. So we've also got to think about these art forms and why are we valuing some over others. I mean, textiles has had a big resurgence now, but for many years, again, textiles was considered, that's just making rugs or making carpets or wall hangings.
Exactly. And I think that's, I talk about it this way. I think that when the Industrial Revolution happened at the end of the 18th century, you get a loss of millions of artisans.
Yes.
And so what happens is that you have then the focus of art becomes almost exclusively painting and sculpture. And so anyone who's still doing artisan work is considered not an artist because a machine could do it. And so we lose what they had in the past, which was a deep respect for things like embroidery and haberdashery, making clothes and
clay, I guess,
clay and glass, and I mean, there's all these different layers of art that we miss.
Yes,
and often they were these craft materials.
Yes. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Kara Walker, for example, and she's brought back that idea of cutting out of paper. Making beautiful, a kind of drawing with scissors.
Exactly.
Which when Matisse does it, was suddenly high art. But you can imagine all those women making that kind of work before that were not considered high art.
And the art historian Freya Growley is she's got her book on collage, which is about like women who made collages and cobbled together objects long and they were never considered art by art historians.
Yes,
I do believe they were considered art by the people of the time.
Absolutely.
I think we get a very distorted view of the past if we look solely through what art history has chosen for us.
Yes, definitely. I think that's really important. I mean, I think we're of that perhaps generation. Well, I certainly am, that when you were studying art history, the textbook was always the Gombrich that was given to you, and I was so grateful when Whitney Chadwick wrote Women, Art and Society, because suddenly it's like, oh, hang on, there's all this. And from that moment on, I was always prescribing to my students, you cannot read this without reading this in parallel, because you're getting literally half a story, or not even half, a quarter of a story.
Exactly. It's always painting. It's always painting.
And painting and sculpture are two art forms that are actually expensive to make. Ask any contemporary artist today. That's why a lot of artists are moving, or young artists have moved into digital. It's much cheaper to produce.
Yeah.
So we're talking again about those kinds of exclusions, which prejudice even what kind of art form you're going to take up, I think.
Exactly, yeah. And what you're allowed to do. Yeah,
what can you do? What space? How much space do you need?
Studio
to make
time,
a painting?
all that
Studio,
stuff. Yeah.
all of those things.
Yeah.
And of course, there are women who've used their own bodies as material. And I think that's another really kind of fascinating arena of, which again, you could extend it to thinking about it as a form of sculpture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which at its most extreme would be someone like Orlan, who literally used plastic surgery. And I think the whole debate around her was really interesting, that the point at which she decided to employ surgeons to make her look like this composite Venus, taking a bit of Botticelli, a bit of Raphael, etc. Everybody, all these plastic surgeons were quite happy to comply to make her this image. And then the moment that she wanted to make herself grotesque, and I did have the pleasure, if that's the right word, of seeing her live, actually.
Not the surgery.
No, not the surgery. Okay. Although she was showing the surgery on the
she was.
screen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm too squeamish to watch the surgery. But she had at this point these two kind of horns that she'd had embedded.
They're like cheek implants in her forehead, right?
Yeah, cheek implants in her forehead, which looked like these two horns. And she could only find a female plastic surgeon to do it, because of course all these men were, not because it was dangerous or because they were worried about her psychological health, which could have been a reason for not doing all the other surgeries, to be honest, but because it didn't fit with their aesthetic. It no longer was an artwork to them. So there's this kind of limitation on how do we view women using their own bodies? What are they actually allowed to do? We're allowed to see plenty of paintings of naked women, but what happens if that woman is live in front of you on stage and think of Carolee Schneemann, pulling out a scroll from her vulva, then suddenly it's shocking or horrific.
Well, that's Yoko Ono's cut piece. She puts herself on stage, fully clothed, very vulnerable, with a piece of scissors, and then invites people to come up. And, well, she doesn't invite. She just lets it happen. And, of course, a man is the first person to go up and to begin to cut her clothes off. I don't know if that was prompted or not, but for him to do it first or, but it's this, it becomes very uncomfortable. But it also starts to become a little bit expected that a woman puts her body in.
This is very true.
To vulnerability, whereas we see very few male artists doing it in the same way about like concepts of sexuality and vulnerability, whereas people like, I'm thinking of Chris Burden, who had himself shot in 1971. That's very different to Yoko Ono's cut piece, which is more about vulnerability and, someone could easily turn the scissors against her. That's kind of where women's performance art sits. More than that kind of bravado that we see with male performance art.
And some of it is problematic, if I'm honest, because some of it tips over into a kind of masochism and sometimes you feel, there's enough violence against women. Do we need to be seeing it done in this way? And I guess my other problem around some of these artists, and I think it's fair, I can name her because it was in the papers, but Marina Abramovich, for example, when she had her show in Florence, there was quite an outcry because it turned out that she wasn't paying the performers. And there's this kind of cult, isn't there, around these figures that people are, and we've all done it, we've all worked for free in various projects, let's say, because we believe in the project and its experience, etc. But it becomes problematic for me as a feminist if you're an artist of that caliber, of that stature, who can command money for your work, that you are then not paying performers. So what I don't want to see is a kind of career feminism, let's say.
That is that girl boss that I was talking about.
Going back to your girl boss thing, where, it's fine for this individual woman to become a star, but what about all those people around her? And I think you and I are quite similar in this, in that we very much believe that there is space for women to let's duck out of this competitive narrative that patriarchy has imposed upon women. We are not in competition. Your success does not preclude mine, okay? It should not be like that. And women should be using opportunities to boost one another. And I don't see that much of that, to be honest. I think we could see a lot more of that. And I don't mean boosting people in a different field. That's easy. I could sit here all day and boost the careers of painters and sculptors because I'm not doing those things. I'm only writing about them.
Yeah.
Let me boost the careers of other art historians. Say, hey, she's great. She, you know, I mean, that to me is kind of genuine feminism.
Exactly, to get rid of the ideas of competition and like you're always trying to get the scoop, you're trying to be the face, you're trying to be that. It gets really exhausting and you stop doing good work.
Yes, I think
I think that's happened with a lot of these artists who have gotten so big that they kind of have to feel the need to perform and kind of stop doing meaningful things because they've got to always meet the mark.
Yes.
And with feminist artists, they often play the cliche as well of what you're talking about.
I think feminism. So. I think so. And working as part of a collective has really, brought that home to me that it is possible. It's perfectly possible for women to work together in a collective way without having this need to always outperform, outcompete, etc. one another.
Yeah.
So message to those.
Exactly.
Message to those people. Just think about who else's career could you be boosting at this point. And it doesn't take much, to be honest, does it?
No, it doesn't. I'm teaching a course right now on women in the art world and how we need patrons and we need people to support and cheer each other on, and we need to come together as collectives. And I think that is also completely feminist vision.
Women are doing it in dating, right? That women are saying we want to descend to men for a while and focus on ourselves, and I think we could do this more, actually.
The need for movements, collectives and collaborators,
which again is kind of very 1970s in some ways, but hopefully we've learned to be more intersectional, to think much more about the intersection of class and race, and not just this white middle class kind of feminist movement. That brings us to the question: if there were any women who were excluded, from major art movements. I think you said something really interesting earlier, that at what point are they excluded? Because often they're not excluded at the time; they're being excluded later. Through art historians. So again, going back to the wonderful Griselda Pollock, she mentions, when you're looking at the careers of the Russian artists, Rodchenko and Stepanova, these are people that worked together.
Yes, exactly.
So the point at which an art historian decides to only write about Rodchenko is the point of exclusion, not the point when these artists are making work in the early 1900s, by the way,
Exactly.
So,
and there's the whole thing about Pollock and Krasner. So Pollock and Lee Krasner. Pollock becomes a bad guy because it is presented that he's the great artist and that he kind of shunted Lee Krasner to the side, and she doesn't tell the story that way.
No, she doesn't.
She actually stepped away from art because of personal reasons and was in a way mentoring him and supporting his career because she felt she had reached a dead end or was in a block. But the story is told that he's a villain because he made her work for him or do whatever, and it's just such a distorted narrative because we're used to that cliche.
Because there are a few. I mean,
there are a few for sure.
Not looking at you, Hopper, for starters. That was a really.
Or Felix Braquemont, who suppressed his wife Marie.
Yes, so there are a few, but you're right. We need nuance. It's not always this black and white. There's lots of grey, and also to look at the labour of those women and not dismiss that labour because it doesn't fit into our kind of idea of artistic labour.
Yes.
Look at Krasner. Look at when he has his mental breakdowns. Who's holding the fort together? Who's organising his print studio, the sale of his works, cataloguing, advising, answering letters, invoicing? It's his wife. So there's lots of this hidden labour that goes on that should be considered as part of the story. Emotional labour, for starters. A lot of these women are engaging in emotional labour.
Well, I was thinking about Augusta Savage as part of the Harlem Renaissance and how she is often incredible. Pushed to the side because her works are very figurative and they're very traditional looking.
And we don't have some of them.
Yes,
they've
because
disappeared.
They've been destroyed or disappeared. And she kind of like was the center of the movement.
Yes.
But her work doesn't look like all the other modern artists in the group, like Jacob Lawrence, who I love, but also and
whom
Aaron
she
Douglas.
mentored. You know,
she
was
mentored
very
him.
important to him.
Yeah.
She literally opened up her studio to him.
She did, and she said to the young artists of the generation, she said, there are money and funds for you.
Yes.
And she set up and became a director of an art school that mentored a whole generation of African-American artists in the U.S.
Yeah.
And that story doesn't get told.
As an African-American woman, for those who don't know.
Who had been
very
excluded because she was African-American and because she was a woman from a French art school that she got into. And when they saw that she was a black woman, they said, you're not allowed to come in.
We're not giving you the scholarship.
But she persisted and kept doing it. So there's our story of oppression that does actually happen. But at the end of her career, she no one wanted to see her sculptures because they weren't modern enough.
Yes. And actually that whole strand of women as educators in the art world is very important. They're also kind of, not talked about in enough of a way, I think.
Yeah, that's so important.
Their impact. Yeah, because we're obsessed with this notion of the genius that appears from nowhere. You know, people like Picasso who don't like to acknowledge their sources, if you like.
Yeah, I know. Every source was a woman.
Every source was a woman, exactly.
Yeah.
I heard an interesting theory that Picasso's hatred of women stemmed from the fact that he was gay, but I'm not convinced.
I'm not convinced of that either.
It's a get out of jail free clause that we're not buying.
Yeah, I think people are trying to come up with new narratives all the time.
Absolutely.
And they kind of they grab for straws.
Yeah. And also the way that men perhaps are, held to certain standards of behaviour. But on the other hand, a lot is overlooked and they are rehabilitated.
Yes. Yeah.
So their misogyny is often glossed over. And that is also problematic, I think.
It's easiness, it's the hero narrative, and it doesn't come to nuance. Because Picasso, the story of 20th century painting really can't be told without him. But that doesn't mean you don't need to call him out.
Exactly.
You can talk about his art and you don't actually have to separate the art from the artist.
No.
But you can talk about what he did and the influence he had and how people got a lot of great ideas from looking at his work, but you can also call him out for what he was. And it's this kind of, again, exclusion is easy, inclusion and cleaning someone up is easy. We've got to do the hard work.
Yes.
That's the hard work of an art historian.
Yeah, and I think it does alter how you look at some of the works generally.
It does, and it should.
And it should.
Yeah.
That I'm thinking of that beautiful bust by Bernini. There's a big Bernini exhibition on at the moment in Rome. And this beautiful bust of his mistress Costanza, who was actually the wife of one of his assistants. I mean, she sounds like a fascinating woman, but who then has an affair with Bernini's brother. And what does Bernini do? He sends his henchmen round to cut her face.
Exactly.
And how is he rewarded? The Pope says, well, I think it's about time you got married. So there he is. He gets happily married, has his, 10 children. And his career just continues to persist in the same way. And we will look at the sculpture. Oh, what a beautiful, sensuous sculpture of a woman. But when I look at it, I can't help but think of what's going to happen to this woman.
Exactly.
And that's part also of the story, really. These models, the kind of anonymity of a lot of models in the history of art.
That's something I think that's being worked on by a lot of people right now, is looking at and finding who the models are in works, because I don't like to think of a model as being a thing, but a collaborator. Because
exactly.
That's where's an artist going to get their ideas other than from that collaboration.
Yes.
And I'm thinking Veronica Franco in Venice, the poet, and who inspired so many artists and was a great sitter for them as well. So you can't really... that too is the history of women in art, as well as they're the sitters.
Yes.
But what does that mean? It's not that they're a muse. It's that they're a collaborator. Change that word.
And again, no sort of disrespect, because I think there have been some writers like Ruth Millington who have tried to recalibrate the notion of the muse into what we're talking about. The muse as a collaborator. And also thinking, why is the muse always female? Why are we perceiving this muse to be female? There are women that have painted men, for example.
Oh, yeah.
And they can have a male muse. It's entirely possible. Or women who painted other women and they are their muse. So the word is tricky because it needs a lot of rehabilitating.
It does, yeah.
But the concept of the figure that is there to be painted, sculpted, etc., who acts as a collaborator is really worth investigating and interesting.
Yeah, that idea of collaboration is because the idea of like excluding men completely from the narrative is just as harmful as excluding women.
Exactly.
Because if we're going to rewrite the institutions and the structure of things, we need to talk about how men and women collaborated and how these groups are not solely about a competition, as you were saying before.
Yes.
And I've heard like sometimes Alfred Stieglitz is pitted against Georgia O'Keeffe. And I find that strange because they deeply loved each other and they didn't see each other as competitive with one another.
No.
And so there's that, again, we want to create an adversarial relationship as part of like excitement. Let's tell the anecdote of art history that it's not always that way.
And I think art history is guilty of this with men as well, to be honest. You know, Renaissance rivals, Michelangelo, Raphael, and you always, what you get is the repetition of this same dull narrative. You know, to be honest, it's dull because what about when they weren't rivals? What about their collaborations? What about the fact they're just coexisting as peers and learning from one another? There's a certain amount of rivalry, yes, for commissions, but it's not helpful because it just channels it into these main three characters without looking at everyone else around them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let's talk about Perugino. Let's talk about Pinturicchio. Let's talk about these lesser known artists who were superstars in their own time, incidentally.
Exactly.
But don't suit the narrative.
Yeah, they don't suit the narrative. Women's art, it's not seen as universal enough.
No.
Or it's not seen as like speaking to the human condition. It's always domesticated and sensitive, and the way that histories are rewritten from decades later.
That has been the same, I think, the same issue with a lot of women's writing, hasn't it? You know, a lot of women's literature is perceived in that way. Women's literature, this is a book for women about women, can't possibly be universal. And yet men can write the great American novel.
Exactly. That.
And somehow that's okay. It's not perceived to be just about men. It's perceived to be the great American novel.
Yeah.
I think you see the same case with someone like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda Fitzgerald, where he's literally plundering her diaries.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a fabulous writer, love his writing, etc., etc. But his rage when she then decides to bring out her own novel is very interesting. It's like he feels he has a right to that material that is actually her life.
Yeah.
Her words, literally.
Yeah. It's case by case with every single thing.
Yeah.
And but then what happens is the singular case becomes the exception because it's that the easiness that we have. Where we don't want to tell the uncomfortable stories or the difficult stories or the complex stories, the nuances of things.
So how do we move forward, do we think? This is the $1 million question. How can we shift the dialogue?
I think I come across this in two ways. I try to include as many women in my courses as possible, as I teach a lot of courses. And I don't call them out as here's a woman artist.
No,
I do
absolutely.
that. That's the first thing I do. Yeah. But we come back to this, like there is a distinctive history of being a woman artist. Yeah. And we need to call those things out. So I think it's somewhere in between those things. We just include seamlessly.
Seamless is great.
This is the way, this is the complexity of the time, this is the nuance of the time, and the way that people thought at that time is not the same way that we think today. Or we have a distorted view of the past that has been created by history.
Yes.
The history of heroes.
Yes.
Male heroes.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I do think we need to have areas where we do focus on why a woman would have been excluded or what the story of women was in a particular time period that made their work distinctive to their male contemporaries. So I think it's both. It's both.
And to keep kind of having these exhibitions where we delve more deeply into individual women artists, you know, not just the ones everyone knows, but the ones people do not know. Let's do the research around some of these and bring those names so that everyone does know who Lavinia Fontana is, for example. And the other thing I think is being really aware that you're not just telling the same story. So I saw several posts, some from women, not you, not me, I hasten to say, on International Women's Day, going, here are 5 women I want to celebrate. Here are 5 women artists. And I thought, what, you really couldn't include one woman of colour in that list? Yep. Now, that to me is unacceptable. You know, there are so many incredible women, contemporary artists. I mean, you know, we all know Micheline Thomas, Carol, we could go on. It doesn't sit with me that you would not include one.
It's a bit exhausting.
Yeah. It's exhausting because you're constantly kind of calling this out.
Yeah.
And why is it important? We know why it's important, because we know it's important for artists to see themselves represented, for people to see themselves represented, and to feel that art is not something they're excluded from. So I think every little thing that you can do is really important.
Yeah.
As you say, just integrating women into your lectures. And if there are none, there should be a really good reason why you have not got a single woman in your lecture,
and
you
that
need
should
to address
be
it.
That should be what you address.
You
exactly
foreground
that.
it.
You say there are no women here because of this, and then you can talk. It's an invitation to talk about those structures.
Because there was a male lecturer, and I'm not going to name him. I'm not going to name him, but I hear from one of my students that they were talking about abstract expressionism, and they said, "Oh, how come there's no women artists in this lecture?" And this lecturer said, well, we've got to talk about the main guys first. And that for me, it's still happening.
Yeah.
So we mustn't think that the battle is won. And I think that's really important.
That's so important.
Yeah.
Because people go, okay, well, this has brought my attention to it. But it's oftentimes it gets watered down.
It gets
and
very
then we feel like
down.
I've done the tick box and everything's fixed now. And now we can move on. And it's not. It's constant work.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking about being a historian. That's what's important, is that we tell new stories so that we get people to think about themselves now differently.
Yes.
Like they change their view of what they thought was possible, because history is about studying other possibilities for this world. And if it's always the narrative that we think we know, then we're never going to see different possibilities.
No, exactly.
So,
and kind of excavate the archive, because there's still a lot of evidence in archives that has not been foregrounded, not been brought forward. You just need to think differently about how we approach things. Oral histories, for example, there are other ways that histories are being told. We should be collecting oral histories as well, I think, from artists of a certain age that we feel might disappear soon, and we will regret that we didn't ask them to put down their particular histories.
Yeah, speaking it out instead of always being in text, that it's in their words, because not everybody's writing.
Exactly.
Not everybody can write.
No.
Or wants to write.
Yes.
Exactly that.
Absolutely. Or perhaps they're not being asked the questions they would like to answer as well. So there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah, I was writing something on Earthworks movement, and Virginia Dwan, who is like the main patron of the movement, and she's often they called her like a jet age Medici, and they kind of making her seem like she was a secondary figure, but she was out scouting those sites with the Earthworks artists, and she was there taking photographs and mentoring them and talking about what worked and what didn't work. And so
it's a collaboration, really, that is not spoken about, because it's much more dramatic to have these male artists going into the wilderness, making these huge works.
Exactly.
But then we have to make pilgrimages too.
And
there's a lot of
she just threw money at it.
And she just threw money at it. Exactly.
No. Yeah. Well, Robert Smithson dies young, but he has, he always praised her.
Yes.
But her oral history that she tells to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. is this lengthy, weeks-long interview where she talks about all the work she did with them, and she wouldn't have written that down otherwise. No. So exactly, other kinds of sources.
Yes, other kinds of sources. I mean, a huge shout out to my fellow lecturer and writer Sarah Dunant, who's just published a big book on Isabella d'Este, in which she mined the archive for letters. A huge female Renaissance patron. These are the kinds of books that should be being published in mainstream publishing, that level of detail, because there's so many female patrons that are not
and they art wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
And they're also collaborators.
Yes.
They're saying, what about this subject and what about this material? And I'm also thinking about the representation of women in art, because I was just thinking about like the Arnolfini portrait, which, Erwin Panofsky, who wrote about it first in 1934, doesn't really address who the woman is in the painting.
No. And they had a theory. And
in 2003, Margaret L. Coster, she writes about, well, this is her name.
Yes, this is her name.
Finally.
And these clothes maybe tell us this.
Exactly.
Actually analysing the materiality. So I think that's always really interesting.
And she goes into the hard records as well. The boring archives.
Yes, the boring archives that no one could be bothered with, because it's all about the artist and absolutely. I think that's definitely, hopefully will change.
Yes.
Hopefully the structures will change, because art education is on its knees in many cases. Art art history being taken out of schools. So all of this is going to impact hugely, I think, on the next generations of women art historians and artists.
And I think the way that I always like to think about history is that you're writing future memory.
Yes.
And so if we write the histories that we want to have today, these will shape the memory that we have in the future. And that's a very powerful act to have that role as a historian, is to tell these new stories so that we can shape a different future. Yeah.
Subscribe for more episodes of Artfully Said, brought to you by the Arts Society.